this episode, we start by focusing on a reality that surprises many new learners. Even if your own systems are well designed, your privacy risk can still explode through vendors, service providers, and the broader supply chain. Modern organizations rely on outside companies for hosting, analytics, customer support tools, marketing platforms, identity services, and many other functions, and personal information often flows into those services as part of normal operations. The CDPSE exam treats vendor and supply chain management as a core privacy engineering skill because obligations do not disappear when data leaves your direct control. Instead, the challenge becomes maintaining control through clear requirements, contracts, oversight, and evidence, especially when something goes wrong and everyone is stressed. Under pressure, weak vendor controls fail in predictable ways. Responsibilities become unclear, timelines slip, data flows are misunderstood, and the organization cannot prove what happened or what was done. Strong vendor controls, in contrast, allow an organization to respond quickly and confidently because expectations were set in advance and monitoring data exists. This is why vendor management is not a one-time paperwork task, but an ongoing control system that supports governance, risk management, data lifecycle control, and technical safeguards. By the end, you should be able to see vendor privacy controls as a practical way to prevent loss of control, not just as legal language. A helpful first step is understanding what makes vendor privacy risk different from internal risk, because the source of risk is not only the vendor's technology, but also the boundary between organizations. When a vendor processes personal information, you are introducing a second environment with its own people, processes, tools, subcontractors, and change timelines. You may not have full visibility into how the vendor stores data, who accesses it, or how quickly they respond to incidents, and yet you may still be responsible for outcomes like rights fulfillment and breach notifications. Vendor risk can also be amplified by concentration, meaning the same vendor might be used across multiple business units, so one weak point affects many systems. Another difference is that vendor risk tends to be dynamic because vendors evolve their services, add subprocessors, expand regions, and change security practices over time. Supply chain risk also includes the vendor's vendors, because data can be passed along to subcontractors, cloud providers, or support partners without your organization noticing unless controls require disclosure. The exam expects you to recognize this boundary risk and to choose controls that create enforceable expectations. In privacy engineering terms, you are building a governance and oversight layer that keeps processing aligned with your obligations even when execution occurs elsewhere. Before you can control vendor privacy risk, you have to define the relationship clearly, because many controls depend on whether the vendor is acting on your behalf or using data for its own purposes. In privacy engineering language, this often maps to whether the vendor is a processor-type relationship where the vendor follows your instructions, or a more independent relationship where the vendor might determine its own purposes. The exam often tests this distinction because it changes what contract terms, oversight, and transparency requirements are appropriate. If a vendor is processing on your behalf, you typically need strong limits on permitted processing, clear instructions, and an obligation to support rights requests and incidents. If a vendor uses data for its own purposes, you may be dealing with a separate disclosure or sharing relationship, which can require different transparency, choice, and accountability steps. Many beginner mistakes come from treating every vendor as the same, which leads to mismatched controls. A privacy engineer should be able to look at a vendor use case and ask, what data is shared, for what purpose, who decides the purpose, and what downstream sharing occurs. Once you can answer those questions, you can build controls that match the reality of the relationship instead of relying on assumptions. Vendor privacy control begins with due diligence, but due diligence must be meaningful and proportional to risk rather than a generic checklist. Due diligence should confirm that the vendor can meet your required privacy and security expectations, that they have appropriate safeguards, and that they have processes for incidents, rights requests, and subprocessor management. The exam may test this by describing a high-risk processing scenario, such as a vendor handling sensitive personal information or large volumes of user data, and asking what should happen before onboarding. A strong answer typically includes evaluating the vendor's controls, confirming where processing occurs, and verifying their ability to meet your response timelines and cooperation needs. Due diligence should also include understanding what data the vendor truly needs, because minimizing shared data reduces risk immediately. Another practical element is aligning the vendor's practices to your transparency obligations, because you must be able to describe sharing accurately to individuals and stakeholders. For beginners, it helps to remember that due diligence is about capability and fit, not about collecting documents. If the vendor cannot meet your requirements, no contract language will fix the underlying mismatch. Contracts are where vendor privacy controls become enforceable, and the exam often treats contract terms as essential because they turn expectations into obligations with consequences. A strong privacy-focused contract defines permitted processing purposes, prohibits unauthorized uses, and requires the vendor to protect personal information with safeguards appropriate to risk. It also sets requirements for confidentiality, access controls, incident notification timelines, cooperation during investigations, and support for rights requests. Another key area is subprocessors, because contracts should require disclosure and approval rules for subcontractors, along with flow-down obligations so subcontractors meet the same standards. Contracts should also address data retention and deletion, including what happens when the relationship ends and how deletion is confirmed. The exam may test whether you understand that contracts must match operational reality, meaning timelines must be achievable and definitions must be clear enough to be enforced. It may also test whether you choose terms that allow verification, such as audit rights or evidence provisions, rather than blindly trusting vendor assurances. For brand new learners, it is useful to think of contracts as the control interface between organizations, defining what the vendor must do and what proof they must provide. Operational oversight is where many vendor programs weaken over time, because organizations often do strong onboarding and then assume risk is solved. In reality, vendor services change, data flows expand, and people rotate, so oversight must continue through monitoring, periodic reviews, and change notifications. The exam may test this by describing a vendor that adds a new feature or expands into a new region and asking what the organization should do. A strong answer often includes reassessing risk, updating documentation, and confirming that contract terms and safeguards still apply to the new processing. Oversight can include reviewing independent reports, validating incident response readiness, checking rights request cooperation performance, and ensuring that retention and deletion practices are followed. It can also include monitoring whether data sent to the vendor matches what was approved, because scope creep is a common source of privacy exposure. Oversight should be risk-based, meaning higher-risk vendors receive more frequent and deeper review, while lower-risk vendors receive lighter oversight. The important principle is that vendor controls must remain active, not static, because static controls become outdated as the environment changes. Data flow control is another core component of vendor privacy engineering because you cannot manage what you cannot see. When personal information is shared with a vendor, you should know what data categories are involved, what triggers the transfer, where the data is stored and processed, and whether the vendor passes data onward. The exam connects this to Domain 3 thinking, even though the topic is in Domain 1, because vendor management requires accurate data inventory and data flow mapping. A common exam scenario involves a team integrating a new tool and quietly sending more data than necessary, which increases risk and can create transparency problems. A strong response involves minimizing the data shared, limiting transfers to what is needed for the purpose, and documenting the data flow so it can support rights requests and incident response. Data flow control also includes access control thinking, because when a vendor receives data, the vendor's internal access patterns matter, and the organization should require appropriate restrictions. Another subtle point is that vendor data can end up in logs, support tickets, or backups on the vendor side, which complicates retention and deletion. When you treat vendor relationships as data flows with controls, you stay aligned with exam expectations. Vendor controls are most truly tested during incidents, because that is when the organization needs speed, clarity, and cooperation. Under pressure, organizations discover whether contract terms are practical, whether communication channels are established, and whether the vendor can provide accurate information quickly. The exam may test this by describing an incident involving a vendor and asking what actions the organization should take, such as ensuring prompt notification, preserving evidence, understanding scope, and coordinating response and communication. A mature vendor program includes requirements for incident notification within a defined time window, requirements for vendor cooperation, and a plan for joint investigation and remediation. It also includes contact lists, escalation paths, and expectations for what information the vendor must provide, such as what data was affected, how exposure occurred, and what controls failed. Another key is that the organization must be able to assess obligations to notify individuals or regulators, which depends on accurate data category and scope information from the vendor. If the vendor cannot provide that, the organization may be forced into conservative decisions that increase cost and reputational harm. Strong vendor incident readiness reduces uncertainty and helps the organization respond responsibly. Data subject rights requests are another stress point because vendor cooperation is often necessary to provide complete responses. If a person requests access or deletion and their data exists in vendor systems, the organization must ensure the vendor can locate and act on the data within the required timeline. The exam may test whether you recognize that vendor contracts and procedures must include rights request support, not only security safeguards. This includes defining how requests are transmitted to the vendor, how identity is verified appropriately, how completion is confirmed, and how exceptions are handled. It also includes ensuring that vendor subprocessors are included in the response path when they hold relevant data. A common failure pattern is that the organization responds based on its own systems but forgets vendor-held data, leading to incomplete responses. Another failure pattern is that the vendor cannot perform deletion properly because data is embedded in logs or backups without a plan for constrained retention. The privacy engineer's job is to anticipate these problems during onboarding, not discover them during a live request. When vendor controls support rights processes, accountability remains real even when data is distributed. Supply chain privacy management extends beyond direct vendors because indirect relationships can create hidden processing and hidden risk. A vendor may rely on cloud infrastructure, outsourced support, analytics subprocessors, or data storage providers, and those parties can access or store personal information depending on the service design. The exam often tests whether you understand that subprocessors must be controlled through disclosure requirements, approval processes, and flow-down obligations, because otherwise data can spread beyond the organization's knowledge. Supply chain thinking also includes resilience, because an outage or failure at a vendor can disrupt rights handling, transparency commitments, or incident response processes. Another aspect is concentration risk, where a single vendor supports many critical functions, and a privacy failure at that vendor affects multiple business areas simultaneously. A privacy engineer helps manage these risks by requiring visibility, maintaining inventories of vendor relationships, and aligning contingency plans with privacy obligations. This does not mean the organization must control every detail of every subcontractor, but it must have a defensible approach to oversight and accountability. The goal is to prevent surprise, because surprise is what causes loss of control during audits and incidents. As we close, engineering vendor and supply chain privacy controls that hold up under pressure means building a system of governance, contracts, oversight, and data flow visibility that keeps processing aligned with your obligations even when work is performed outside your organization. You begin by defining the relationship clearly, because responsibilities differ depending on who decides the purposes and how data is used. You perform meaningful, risk-based due diligence to confirm vendors can meet requirements, and you minimize shared data to reduce exposure from the start. You turn expectations into enforceable contract terms that limit processing, control subprocessors, require safeguards, and demand cooperation for incidents and rights requests, with evidence provisions that allow verification. You maintain ongoing oversight so controls do not decay as services change, and you keep data flow documentation current so you can respond accurately to audits, incidents, and requests. Under pressure, strong vendor controls provide clear timelines, clear communication paths, and reliable information that supports fast, correct decisions. The CDPS exam rewards this domain because vendor relationships are one of the most common ways organizations lose privacy control, and a privacy engineer's job is to design controls that prevent that loss and keep accountability real.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.